On the 14th of March, 1889, a woman measuring 7 feet and 2 inches tall was admitted to Cook County Hospital in Chicago. She was in labor. She was alone. And according to every official record that followed, neither she nor her child ever left that building as free people. That's where the story starts. Or rather, that's where the story stops. The records go quiet in a very specific way. Not the way records go quiet when something mundane happened and nobody bothered to write it down. The quiet here has texture. It has edges. Certain pages in the Cook County admission ledgers for that March are written in a different ink than the pages surrounding them. I found this while researching something else entirely, the history of medical documentation practices in late 19th century Illinois, and when I saw those pages, I sat with them for a long time. A different ink. Same handwriting, but different ink. It's a small detail, maybe nothing, but it sits in the mind the way a splinter sits in a finger. You forget about it for hours and then, without warning, it's all you can feel. Her name, according to the one surviving intake document, was Marta Voss, a German immigrant, age 26. Her height was recorded not once but 3 times on that single page, as if whoever filled it out couldn't quite believe what they were measuring. 7 feet, 2 inches. 7 feet, 2 inches. 7 feet, 2 inches. The repetition reads less like careful documentation and more like a person trying to convince themselves of something. That is where we begin, with a woman who was too large to be ignored, in a city that was very, very good at making people disappear. The official story goes like this. In the late 1880s, Chicago was a city in the throes of transformation. The World's Columbian Exposition was 4 years away. The stockyards were thundering. Immigration was flooding in from Germany, Poland, Ireland, Bohemia. Cook County Hospital, founded in 1866, was overwhelmed, understaffed, under-resourced, processing hundreds of indigent patients each week. Marta Voss, by the official accounting, arrived in the early morning hours of March 14th. She was, by the hospital's characterization, an indigent patient of unusual physical stature. Her condition upon arrival was described as advanced labor, full term. She was placed in Ward 7, which was the designated space for women considered medically complex. Let me be fair to the official narrative here. Hospitals in 1889 were not what we picture today. Germ theory was new. Surgical mortality was catastrophic by modern measures. Record-keeping was inconsistent, sometimes deliberately vague for reasons having nothing to do with conspiracy, liability, embarrassment, professional rivalry. A woman dying in labor in 1889 Chicago was not remarkable. A woman dying in labor and her infant dying shortly after was not remarkable. These were tragedies, but they were common tragedies. The official narrative suggests Marta Voss died of complications following delivery. The child, a boy, is listed in one subsequent ledger. A different ledger, filed separately, discovered in a basement archive in 1973, as having been transferred to the Illinois Children's Home and Aid Society. The entry is dated 4 days after the mother's listed death. Standard procedure for orphaned infants of deceased indigent patients. Standard procedure. That phrase is doing a lot of work. Let's look at what it's actually holding up. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers here are not subtle. The timeline isn't subtle either, but I want to begin with something concrete. Between 1885 and 1892, the Illinois Children's Home and Aid Society received, by their own published annual reports, an average of 14 infants per month from Cook County Hospital. 14. That number held remarkably steady across those 7 years, with minor seasonal variation. January and February ran slightly higher. Summer months ran slightly lower. March of 1889 shows 22 transfers. 22 in a single month, against a 7-year average of 14. That is a 57% spike in one calendar month. The reports offer no explanation, no epidemic footnote, no reference to a particular disaster or wave of admissions. The number simply appears, stands there, and the next month returns to 15. One of those 22 transfers corresponds to the entry bearing what appears to be a relation to Marta Voss's son. The entry gives the child no name, just an age, 4 days, and a notation, special case, referred by attending physician. The attending physician's name in that notation is partially obscured. The first 3 letters are visible, AR. Speaking of names, there was a physician named Dr. Edmund Garrison who held a staff position at Cook County Hospital from 1887 to 1891. Garrison, there. He left the hospital in June of 1891, with no listed reason in the staff records. He resurfaced 18 months later as a medical consultant to the United States Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C. The Army Medical Museum. In 1893, that institution published a catalog of its pathological collection. Among the entries, and I want to be precise here because precision matters, among the entries is a series of anatomical measurements described as belonging to a female subject of exceptional stature, acquired 1889, Chicago, Cook County. The entry number is 1147B. The measurements are consistent with a woman of approximately 7 feet in height. Entry 1147B is flagged in the catalog's index as subject deceased. Remains retained for scientific study per directive of the Surgeon General's office. Per directive of the Surgeon General's office. Which brings me to the political context, because here is where the picture widens in ways that are genuinely difficult to dismiss as coincidence. In 1889, the United States government was in the middle of a quiet but aggressive campaign to collect what the era called anthropological specimens. This is documented history, not fringe interpretation. The Surgeon General's office, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, and several major university medical programs had formal, if largely informal, arrangements with hospitals in immigrant-heavy cities to identify and, after death, retain the bodies of individuals deemed scientifically notable. The criteria for scientifically notable in 1889 were as ugly as you'd expect. Racial difference, physical abnormality, unusual height, weight, cranial measurement. The word used in internal correspondence that is now partially available through the National Archives, was exceptional specimens. Marta Voss would have been, by those criteria, extraordinary. A 7-foot 2-inch German immigrant woman in active labor in a Chicago hospital in 1889 would not have gone unnoticed by anyone with connections to that network. And Dr. J.R. Garrison, whatever his full name, took a position at the Army Medical Museum 4 years after her admission. That is either a line connecting 2 points or it is nothing. But here's what matters most, and this is the part one keep returning to: the child. The Illinois Children's Home and Aid Society transferred children to adoptive families, to church institutions, and occasionally to state facilities. Their records from 1889 to 1905 were, largely, maintained. Not perfectly, but largely. When researchers in the 1970s began excavating the history of Illinois child welfare, they were able to trace most of those 14 per month Cook County transfers through the system. Not all of them, but most. The 22 transfers from March 1889, 7 of them are untraceable. Not missing records in the usual sense, records that were burned or flooded or simply never filed. These 7 have intake entries at the Aid Society and then nothing. No placement record, no mortality record, no transfer out record. They arrive in the ledger and then cease to exist within it. One of those 7 is the infant described as special case, referred by attending physician. 7 children disappeared into a welfare system that, for 18 others admitted that same month, worked more or less as intended. Maybe those 7 died in infancy and the records were lost. Maybe the Aid Society's filing system was inconsistent and these cases simply fell through administrative cracks. These are reasonable explanations. I hold them seriously. But then I find something else. I found this while pulling Aid Society annual reports from an Illinois state archive, not looking for anything related to Marta Voss at all. In the Aid Society's 1891 annual report, 2 years after the March anomaly, there is a reference, buried in a financial accounting section, to a category of transfer described as private placements, scientific families. This category appears in no other annual report before or after 1891. It accounts for 11 children placed between 1889 and 1891. It lists no names, no family destinations, only a total number and the phrase, as arranged. As arranged, 11 children, scientific families. As arranged, the timing is almost theatrical. Now, I want to stop here and be honest about what I'm doing, because this kind of investigation has a responsibility that I take seriously. I am connecting documented facts with documented facts through chains of inference. The ink anomaly in the Cook County ledger is real. I've seen it. The 57% spike in aid society transfers is drawn from their own published reports. Entry 1147B in the Army Medical Museum catalog is a matter of public record. The private placements, scientific families language in the 1891 Aid Society report is a verbatim transcription from a physical document held in the Illinois State Archives. What I cannot tell you is that these facts constitute a deliberate plan. I cannot tell you that Marta Voss was murdered. I cannot tell you that her son was taken to be raised as a medical subject. I cannot prove that Dr. J.R. Garrison was the mechanism connecting a woman in labor to a Washington institution's collection catalog. What I can tell you is that these facts exist, that they are adjacent to each other in time and in institutional networks, that the specific combination of anomalies here, the ink, the number spike, the catalog entry, the as-arranged language, does not occur in any other comparable hospital-to-welfare agency pipeline I examined during 3 years of research. Only this one. Only March 1889. Only Cook County. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But there are things that fit together too precisely for comfort. The Army Medical Museum's active collection program and the Cook County Hospital's informal relationship with that program, documented in 2 surviving letters from 1887 and 1890, respectively. The fact that exceptional stature was an explicit criterion in the Surgeon General's office collection directives, found in their own internal memoranda. The fact that Garrison's departure from Cook County came immediately after a different controversy, a complaint filed by a German immigrant family in 1891 alleging that a deceased relative's body had been retained without consent. The complaint is in the Cook County Clerk's civil filings for that year, case number 1891, CR 447. It was dismissed. No reason given. Speaking of silences, the German immigrant community in Chicago in 1889 was large, organized, and politically conscious. Several German-language newspapers operated in the city. The Illinois Staatszeitung ran local news avidly. If a 7'2" German woman died under unusual circumstances at Cook County Hospital, you would reasonably expect some mention in that press. I searched the Illinois Staatszeitung archives for March through June 1889. Nothing. Not one reference to Marta Voss. Not one reference to an unusually tall German woman. Not one death notice matching her description. That absence could mean many things. It could mean she had no community connections, no friends who would have submitted a notice, no relatives in Chicago to mourn publicly. That is entirely possible. She arrived described as alone. She may have been profoundly isolated. Or it could mean something was managed. Something was kept quiet. In a city where German immigrants knew their own, a 7'2" woman in her community would not have been invisible. Someone would have known her. Someone would have known she was pregnant. Someone would have known she went to Cook County and didn't come back. That someone never spoke to a newspaper. Or if they did, those words never reached print. Maybe the ink anomaly is a restocking coincidence. Maybe the transfer number spiked because of an undocumented illness in another ward. Maybe entry 1147B in the Army Medical Museum catalog is a different woman entirely, and the Chicago notation is clerical error. Maybe Garrison moved to Washington for reasons that had nothing to do with Marta Voss or her child. Maybe the scientific family's language in the Aid Society report refers to something benign, families of physicians who adopted children as a form of professional charity. Maybe those 7 untraceable infants from March 1889 all died quietly in their first months and the records were simply never filed. Maybe I'm connecting dots that aren't dots. Maybe this is the mind doing what the mind does, finding faces in wallpaper, finding systems in randomness. But here is what I cannot make disappear. A 26-year-old woman came to a Chicago hospital on March 14, 1889. She was 7 feet and 2 inches tall, and her height was written down 3 times by the person who processed her intake. She gave birth. She is listed as deceased. Her child is listed as transferred. And then, when you pull the thread, when you follow the ink, the numbers, the catalog entries, the financial reports, the civil filings, the staff records, the thread doesn't go cold. It goes somewhere specific. It goes to Washington. It goes to a program. It goes to 11 children placed with scientific families as arranged. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago in May of 1893, 4 years after Marta Voss was admitted to Cook County Hospital. 18 million people came to see it. The fair had an entire section devoted to anthropological exhibits, live exhibits, ethnographic demonstrations. The Surgeon General's office contributed materials. Several university medical departments contributed materials. I don't know if any of those materials had anything to do with a German woman and her child. But I know that entry 1147B in the Army Medical Museum catalog carries a second annotation, added in 1893. The annotation reads, Exhibited, Classification 7. Exhibited. There is no record of what Classification 7 means. The museum's own internal classification system for that period has not survived in full. 3 partial documents remain, and they account for classifications 1 through 5. Classifications 6 and 7 are absent from every surviving page. There is no record of whether the child of Marta Voss grew up anywhere or as anyone. There is no record of where he was buried, if he died young. There is no adoption record bearing his name, because he was never given one in any document I have found. He exists in the archive as a 4-day-old boy, transferred as a special case, referred by a physician whose name begins with GR, to a welfare organization that placed some children with families and placed others as arranged. That is all we have of him. And maybe that's all there ever was. Maybe a woman died alone in a hospital in a hard city in a hard century, and her child went into a system that swallowed him, and the swallowing was ordinary cruelty rather than calculated theft. Ordinary cruelty was abundant in 1889. It did not require conspiracy to operate. It required only indifference, and indifference was very well funded. But I keep thinking about those 3 repetitions on the intake form. 7 feet, 2 inches. 7 feet, 2 inches. 7 feet, 2 inches. Someone sat at a desk in the early morning hours of March 14, 1889, with a form and a pen, and wrote that same measurement 3 times. I think about what they were feeling when they wrote it. Disbelief. Awe. Something else. Something that made them reach for documentation the way you reach for a railing in the dark. She was real. She was there. She was seen. And then the institution closed around her like water closing over a stone. And by the time anyone thought to ask what happened, the ripples had long since settled. Whatever was taken from Marta Voss in that hospital, her life, her child, her body, or simply her story, it was taken by people who understood the power of an orderly ledger, who understood that the most effective disappearance is one that looks, from a distance, like paperwork. The file is not closed. It never formally opened. And somewhere in a basement archive, in a catalog no one reads, in an annotation written in 1893 by someone who is also long dead, a woman who measured 7 feet and 2 inches and came to a Chicago hospital alone is still being described as an exhibit. Classification 7. We still don't know what that means.